Welcome to the Popcorn Talk Network. For the online broadcast network that features movie discussion, news, and interviews, press 1. Popcorn Talk. We talk movies.
From the Popcorn Talk Network, the online broadcast network for movie talk, this is Historic Hollywood, spotlighting the most influential and founding members of Hollywood.
Welcome back to Historic Hollywood, a celebration of the cinema of yesteryear and the people who made it. Follow the Popcorn Talk Network on social media. It's on Twitter at the Popcorn Talk Network, youtube.com/Popcorn Talk Network. I am Lex Michael. I'm all over the internet. My handle is at the Lex Michael, and I am here with
Byron Thompson,
Carrie Bible.
And today we are talking Billy Wilder, a very prolific, very influential, very, in a number of ways, revolutionary filmmaker of his era. And I wanted to start, like I often do, by asking both of you, how, if you remember, what was your experience being introduced to the films of Billy Wilder? What was your way in?
Stalag 17.
Yeah?
My parents were big fans of the film. It was something that I guess had come out, I guess maybe 6 or 7 years after World War II. It was actually the idea of the film was what led to the television series, strangely enough, Hogan's Heroes, even though clearly that's just a comedy. But Stalag 17, I think, was the first thing I saw that he did, and I just figured, because of how serious of a film that was, I thought that's clearly his mark, and clearly not at all. As we've learned, he's kind of all over it, much like Howard Hawks. He can do just about anything. But that was my introduction.
Sure. Carrie, what about you?
Mine was Some Like It Hot. I saw it when I was much younger on TV, and I just thought it was so witty and so intelligent and just had this magic to it. And I'm kind of sorry my introduction wasn't a big screen experience, because that would have been way better. But that was a really good film for me to kind of start out with, and that was my gateway drug, if you will, to the world of Billy Wilder.
Yeah, for me, I want to say it was probably Double Indemnity. And I couldn't now, off the top of my head, tell you what drove me to it, because I was familiar with some of his filmography before I was really familiar with Wilder himself, with the man who created it all and tied it all together. But obviously, growing up and being a burgeoning film nerd, I had certainly heard of Sunset Boulevard. I'd heard of movies like Sabrina, The Apartment, Some Like It Hot being another example. But I want to say I was starting to get into noir as a style, and I was starting to really dig into older movies. And Double Indemnity was a title that I just kept seeing pop up over and over and over and over and over again. So I remember watching it, and I couldn't tell you how old I was. I was probably like maybe 18 the first time I saw it. And I have since fallen completely head over heels for this movie. The first time I watched it, it didn't explode my brain the way it has in repeated viewing since. But there were so many these really indelible elements to this movie that I took away from it that stuck with me. But that was my way in, and I think it was a little bit later that I came back around and finally caught up with, for example, Sunset Boulevard and some of his other movies. But the man could make a picture. And we're going to talk about a handful of his more, I would say, maybe more influential, some of his the bigger titles on his filmography. But one thing that I wanted to address specifically, and something that I think we're going to see come up multiple times in our discussion, is that Wilder was a filmmaker, and this is partially due to the era in which he was making movies, but he was a filmmaker that time and time again would push boundaries as far as what was allowed to be depicted in studio films. And we're going to see that with Double Indemnity. We're going to see him make some industry folks pretty grumpy with Sunset Boulevard. We're going to see Lost Weekend is another example of that, and we'll hit on some of these, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth as we go. But I wanted to start, like we frequently do, with his early life. Now, Byron, you and I have talked a little bit, and you mentioned to me that you know a little bit about his upbringing, and I wanted to know where would you start? Where would you start with Billy Wilder as a young man?
Well, instead of starting at a young man, I think one of the things that kind of separated him from a lot of the people that came over, a lot of the immigrants that came, a lot of people were affected by the Holocaust. A lot of people were affected by the Nazis. He lost both of his parents to the Holocaust. So a lot of people that speak about him, scholars and stuff, say that that's where his bite comes from.
Sure.
Clearly, even one of the films that we've already talked about, The 7-Year Itch, he was one of the writers on. Clearly that has the bite, too. It's like almost like a sarcastic, if not sardonic, kind of darkness to it.
Yes.
And a lot of people, especially at the time these movies came out, they were not really into that, but yet he had his followers, because like we were talking about with Hawks, Wilder was one of those other directors that just blew up.
Yes.
In a big way. And I think his dark side, if that's what you want to call it, from his youth, being somebody who was clearly a casualty of all that during World War II, I think that kind of helped push him into what was an industry in Germany. Actually, Carrie and I were talking about it outside the UFA before that became overtaken by the Nazis in 1933. You know, he was a big part of that, thinking it was a trade, not necessarily wanting to maybe entertain somebody, which is clearly what he did in the biggest way, but trying to be one of those people like on the assembly line, editor, director, DP, whatever it is that was the fit. And I just don't think that his ideas were ever what necessarily he became. He was definitely somebody who wanted to fit in at that time.
Sure.
When he was younger.
Yeah, and I just want to touch on, he was born June 22nd, 1909, in what was, at the time, Austria-Hungary. It's now Poland. And his parents were Max and Eugenia Wilder, and they named him Samuel. Billy, if my research is to be believed, was a nickname, an affectionate nickname that was given to him by his mother. And as he was growing up, the spelling that was used was the Billie spelling. He changed it to Billy with a Y when he moved to the United States. His parents, I thought this was interesting, they ran a fairly successful cake shop in their local train station, and they tried for a while to get young Samuel, who would one day be Billy, to join the family business, but of course, to no avail. The family moved to Vienna eventually, and Billy Wilder attended school there, but instead of proceeding to college at, say, the University of Vienna, for example, he decided to become a journalist, and he moved to Berlin to further his career. And this was something else that I thought was really interesting as I was researching his early life. He worked part-time after he moved to Berlin before achieving success as a writer as a taxi dancer. And I didn't know what a taxi dancer was when I read this, so I had to look it up. And a taxi dancer, for those of you in our audience who, like me, have never heard this term before, is you can go to dance halls and essentially pay a partner to dance with you.
Private dancer.
Yeah.
Let me just, I know a bit about this. Basically, at the time, I mean, that concept sounds charming to us probably now, but at the time, that was kind of risque.
Sure.
That was like, you're hiring someone to dance with you. That's a little, it was, some of those people got nicknames like gigolo or very derogative sort of things attached to that. Actually.
So that's interesting that even well before his creative career took off, he was already pushing boundaries in a sense. He was already stepping outside what most people would consider, let's say, in good taste.
He was getting creative.
Yeah, I like that. I like putting it that way, that he was getting creative. Now, in his professional career, as he started to work his way up as a writer, he wrote crime and sports stories as a stringer for local papers, and eventually he developed an interest in the movies, and he began writing screenplays. Among his early works, he wrote the screenplay for the 1931 film adaptation of a novel by Erich Kästner called Emil and the Detectives. Now, it was the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany that eventually spurred him to go elsewhere. He moved to Paris, and he made his directorial debut co-directing a movie with a title that translates to Bad Seed. He directed it with a gentleman named Alexander Ezwe. But before it was released, he had already relocated to Hollywood. Now, you touched on the fact that...
What year was that? Because I have the 1929 film that he did with Robert Sidemak and Fred Zinnemann.
So you brought this up to me before we got on mic, and I maybe missed this when I was doing my research. So yeah, why don't you talk a little bit about that picture?
Well, Carrie's actually seen it, so she can tell us about it.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Robert Sidemak and Fred Zinnemann, Edgar G. Ulmer and Billy Wilder, all directors who came here and became big, successful directors. They were doing these films for the UFA UFA at the time, which was about to become owned by the Nazis. And it was like the last project they did. It was called People on a Sunday, which was kind of a documentary style film about people just kind of hanging out like at the park on a sunny day. But it was that pushed him in 1929 to the next, what you were referring to. But still, like I said, Carrie's actually seen the film.
So what is it? What is that like?
I saw it years ago. I'm kind of an addict of the UCLA Film and TV Archive. They have very affordable screenings here in Los Angeles, like all the time. And I saw it there several years back. It's been a while. I think it's on DVD, actually. But I remember it having this very dreamlike quality of these people just going to the lake and swimming and just kind of enjoying what precious little free time and leisure they had.
Sure.
And I know that may sound kind of boring, but it's really not. It kind of has this beauty and this sort of poetry to it. And I'm so lucky I got to see it, especially on the big screen. But I would definitely recommend it, actually. And again, just if for no other reason, for the incredible cadre of talent that was involved in making that film and what they would, of course, go on to do.
Sure, of course. So, all right. See, and that was interesting, and that was something that when I was doing my research, I missed. But I want to now check this movie out. So I want to get, when we're done with the show, I'm going to get this title again, and I'm going to go look that up and see what's what with that. But so he relocated before this film, The Bad Seed, which was released in 1934. He relocated to Hollywood before its release, and he started writing screenplays within the studio system, and he has a number of screen credits to his name in this period. Among them, Under Pressure for director Raoul Walsh, 1938's Bluebeard's Eighth Wife for Ernst Lubitsch, and that movie is noteworthy because it was his first collaboration with the writer Charles Brackett, who would become one of, I would say, the two biggest screenwriting collaborators for the remainder of Wilder's career. It was Brackett for a number of years, and for the latter part of his career, for a big number of movies, it was the writer I.A.L. Diamond. And we'll get to him a little bit more in a bit. His first significant success was 1939's Ninotchka, which was a movie that he wrote for director Ernst Lubitsch. And it was a screwball comedy which starred Greta Garbo, who up until that point was generally known as a star of really heavy, melodramatic fare. And this marked a bit of a turning point for her in her career. This was her first out-and-out comedy. But it was also, I mean, I say big turning point. This, if I'm not mistaken, was Garbo's second to last film.
Yeah, she did one more film, Two-Faced Woman, which was a flop. And after that, she never made another film again.
Yeah, which is unfortunate. But this movie was very well received, and it actually got him his first Academy Award nomination for screenwriting, a nomination which he shared with Brackett. And after this, he continued collaborating with Brackett on several screenplays. 1940's Arise My Love, box office hits Hold Back the Dawn in 1941, and
Love that movie. Love that movie.
Also, Ball of Fire for Howard Hawks, which is a movie that we talked about a little bit on our Hawks episode.
Also, Midnight with Claudette Colbert and Donna Miche. That's a terrific screwball comedy, and he wrote that as well.
Yes. So, his directorial debut came in 1942. It was a motion picture called The Major and the Minor, which was a comedy that starred Ginger Rogers and Ray Milland, who would go on to collaborate with Wilder again in the relatively near future. After that, a motion picture in 1943 called Five Graves to Cairo, which was a World War II film starring Anne Baxter, which featured a performance from Erich von Stroheim, who would also collaborate with Wilder again in the future. His third film as a director, I would say, tell me if you disagree, but I think it's his third film really that marked his arrival, if you will. It's a movie that blew doors open both for him as a filmmaker, but also stylistically across motion pictures. And I'm talking about 1944's Double Indemnity. Now, there's a lot that we can talk about with Double Indemnity, but I wanted to start by asking you guys what are your general impressions of this movie. In fact, let's start even simpler. What is Double Indemnity about?
It's about a lot of things.
It's about a lot of things.
About a lot of things. God, that's hard to say. Double Indemnity to me is, and I think most noir addicts like myself would agree, it's probably one of the most influential film noirs ever made. Period. And that's saying something, because there were a ton of great ones. The film is about greed. It's about lust. It's about consequences. It's about so many things. There's also a documentary called Los Angeles Plays Itself, which I'm obsessed with, and I've seen like 7 times. And in the documentary, they talk about this one film critic who, I forget the name of them, I'm sorry, but they quote, and they said that Los Angeles is so, I'm butchering this, but it's so important in Double Indemnity, it might as well be a co-conspirator in the crime.
Sure.
Because the city is it is a character in that film. So there's a lot going on in Double Indemnity.
There is the simplest, and I agree with you. There really is no way to do a very succinct version of a plot recap without leaving certain important, certainly thematic elements out. But loosely, it's about two characters played by Fred McMurray and Barbara Stanwyck. Fred McMurray plays Walter Neff, who's an insurance salesman, and Barbara Stanwyck plays Phyllis Dietrichson, who, with Walter Neff, devises a plan to bump off her husband to collect insurance money. And the title Double Indemnity, that term refers in this case to a clause in certain life insurance policies wherein the payout is doubled, where in cases where death is caused, I believe, on a train or other
accident.
Yeah,
and
an
I do want to say that I always have found it a damn shame that Edward G. Robinson did not get an Oscar nomination for this film, because he is fantastic in this film, and his one speech alone about the double indemnity insurance policy is just legendary. It's so good.
Yeah, there's a lot that I find really interesting about the casting of Double Indemnity, and it was a script that existed for a little while, and nobody would not so much that nobody would touch it, nobody was really allowed to touch it because there was so much going on in this movie that the Hayes office had big problems with. Eventually, they were able to sign Barbara Stanwyck because she loved the script so much and she trusted Wilder, but even once she agreed to make the movie, she had some concern about what the content of the movie might do to her career.
You know, you mentioned the Hayes office, and we mentioned it when we were talking about Ball of Fire as well.
Yes.
But a couple of people that I've come in contact with have wanted to really kind of understand what that exactly was. We may know what it is.
I agree with you completely.
But the audience doesn't really, just because they know what a rating is, that's
right.
not the same thing as the Hayes office. And I think it'd be nice just to at least give an idea of what that is, because clearly that's affected these films.
Yes, absolutely. And this is, I think, actually a great spot in the conversation to address the Hayes office because of how big a role it played in the evolution of this movie. And yes, at the time in general, but also specifically where Double Indemnity is concerned in its journey to the screen. So what is the production code? What was the production code?
The studios got together and they were afraid that the government, our hallowed halls of justice, were going to get involved in their filmmaking, and that they were going to dictate what they could and could not do. So specifically, they enlisted somebody who I think was not necessarily a film person. Is it Robert Hayes, I think is his name? Or
Will Hayes, actually. We can actually do a whole show just about the code.
About the production
code,
to be honest
sure.
with
you. Will Hayes was actually the Postmaster General of America.
So male.
Can I run off about this for a moment?
Yeah, go.
Okay. In the early 1920s, believe it or not, there were a lot of people out there who were puritanical, and they felt that Hollywood was sort of corrupting the morals of American youth.
Sure.
Which, if you see some movies, it's kind of hard to think people felt that way, but they absolutely did. And there was a series of scandals in early Hollywood, kind of culminating with the most famous, which would be the Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle scandal. And the studios were terrified that their fledgling industry was truly in jeopardy. And they felt that they needed to sort of self-censor, or else, the government was going to step in, and they felt they needed to take action. And so they brought in Will Hayes, who was a Postmaster General, actually had nothing to do with the film industry, but he was very charming, he was very likable, he was a good spokesperson, and that's kind of what they needed. They needed someone to assure America that Hollywood was safe, and that Hollywood could stay, and they would make clean and wholesome pictures, and so forth. So he was actually hired in, I'm sorry, Barry, I don't mean to just... He was hired in the early 20s to sort of do this job.
Yes.
Now, towards the end of the 20s, when sound arrived, it all sort of fell apart. Again, I'm making this very brief, but it could be much longer. And there was an era, which is one of my favorites in film, called pre-code. So you had 29, 30, 31, 32, and up to mid-1934, when the studios basically paid lip service to the code, but pretty much blatantly ignored it.
Sure.
And if you've ever seen the Barbara Stanwyck film Babyface, she goes on a sexual rampage in that film that it will, for the time, will indeed shock you. And they got away with absolute murder during that time. It's one of my favorite times of filmmaking. But anyway, I digress. By the mid-30s, though, there was such an outcry over the sexuality, over the violence, over the content of a lot of these movies that the code really got teeth by the mid-30s.
Sure.
And from the mid-30s until about the late 60s, the code was kind of hung over Hollywood like a black cloud. You had to kowtow to the code. You had to work around the code. And I think, as much as I dislike censorship, I think in some ways that simply made people more creative.
Yes.
And it led to more innuendo, to more subtle suggestion. And I think it really had a lot of hand in shaping many of these movies to be the great films that they were.
And you mentioned that by the mid-30s was really when, the way you put it, the code got teeth. And the amount of sway that the Hays office had over studio productions was pretty substantive. And I think it's worth noting, you mentioned specifically the mid-30s.
There was a guy named Joseph Breen, by the way. He was the one that was brought in at that time.
Yes, I was actually about to get to Joseph Breen. So the novella that Double Indemnity is based on was written by James M. Cain, and it was published in 1935. And right after it got published, it started catching heat, and every major studio, MGM, Warner Brothers, Paramount, 20th Century Fox, Columbia, everyone was bidding for the rights to this novella, to adapt it into a motion picture. And a letter went out from Joseph Breen at the Hays office, and right after this letter went out to studios, all that bidding stopped. And I have in my notes, I have what the note said. The note said, and I'm quoting, "The general low tone and sordid flavor of this story makes it, in our judgment, thoroughly unacceptable for screen presentation before mixed audiences in the theater. I am sure you will agree that it is most important to avoid what the code calls the hardening of audiences, especially those who are young and impressionable to the thought and fact of crime." And this letter from the Hays office effectively killed the movie then. Killed it for about 8 years. And 8 or so years later, the novella was republished in a collection of Cain's works, and people started paying attention to it again. And Paramount executive Joseph Sistrom thought this would be a really good fit for Billy Wilder. So they put it in front of Billy Wilder. Billy Wilder became interested. And of course, they have to, at this point, if they're going to make the movie, resubmit the script to the Hays office. And even 8 years later, the response was virtually identical. But Wilder, Sistrom, and Paramount executive named Bill Dozier, and I was very excited to see Bill Dozier's name pop up in the story because he's best known for producing the 1960s Batman TV series, which I'm a big fan of. The three of them got together and decided, we're going to do this anyway. So they decided to move forward. They submitted a film treatment that Wilder and Charles Brackett worked on together. And oddly enough, that film treatment made it through the Hays supervision process. There were a few elements that the Hays office still objected to, but they managed to get their treatment through. But the writing of the screenplay became a separate matter altogether. Brackett decided, I wish you all the best, but this material, this story is a little bit too sordid for my taste.
Not to take you off track, but
yes.
In your research, did you cover the Cain Postman Always Rings twice? Because I'm trying to figure out, you said that it was 8 years that they put that on hold.
Yes.
So Postman Always Rings twice, which is also a Cain story.
Yes.
I'm assuming that ran into the same problems, so to speak, even though clearly that's not a Billy Wilder film, but a Cain story of the same ilk, so to speak.
And eventually that too, they were able to adapt more than once into a movie, but that too took
And Mildred
time.
Pierce.
Yes, and Mildred Pierce as well.
So all these things, in a sense, are kind of happening at the same time, even though clearly it's looked down upon as inappropriate material.
Right. And so Brackett himself said, I don't know if I connect to the sordid elements of this screenplay. I wish you all the best. He left the project. So Wilder, in his search for a collaborator, turned to the author Raymond Chandler. Now, Raymond Chandler, for those of us in the audience who are not as familiar with the name, Raymond Chandler is arguably one of the most well-known writers of detective fiction
Pulp
ever.
fiction, for
Pulp
sure.
detective
Absolutely.
fiction ever. He wrote The Big Sleep, which Hawks later made into a movie. He would later write The Long Goodbye. The Philip Marlowe character is his. And the two of them collaborated on this script. And it was Chandler, largely, who suggested, well, we can't just take all the dialogue out of the book and put it in the movie. This is not, it reads great on the page. You can actually have people say this stuff. So it was Chandler's push in that direction, away from strictly adhering to the source material, that created ultimately through his collaboration with Wilder, so many of the wonderful lines and interactions between characters in this movie. It's also worth noting that Chandler was very notoriously an alcoholic, a very, very, very heavy drinker. And as the story goes, the next movie that Wilder would make, The Lost Weekend, which deals very much with alcoholism, he made, at least in part, to try and explain Chandler to himself. But, getting ahead of myself here, the casting, as I mentioned earlier, in this movie is very, very interesting to me. You've got Barbara Stanwyck, who is phenomenal in everything that she ever did.
Always.
Is absolutely, and she is the maybe the quintessential femme fatale in this movie. But you've also got Fred MacMurray, and it's interesting to note that Fred MacMurray's career up until this point had largely been, he was the nice guy. He was the good boy, as it were. And there were a lot of actors that passed on the role of Walter Neff before he accepted it. I believe Wilder approached Alan Ladd, James Cagney, Spencer Tracy, Gregory Peck. But eventually he set his sights on MacMurray, and MacMurray at first said, this isn't me, this isn't the type of role that I play, I'm not right for this. And apparently Wilder just hounded him relentlessly and eventually wore him down. And MacMurray would later say, I can't believe that I almost didn't do this, because this is the best picture I ever made.
Well, I want to say, though, his character, Walter Neff, he doesn't start out as evil. He starts out as kind of an everyman who, it's a hot summer day, he goes up to this house, he sees the ankle bracelet, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? He doesn't start out evil. It's sort of, his soul gets very, very slowly eroded throughout the film. So that's kind of what made that, to me, an interesting
Another thing that I found really fascinating about the casting of that part, when Wilder was looking for an actor to play this role, it was his words. This is not, I'm not certainly going to besmirch the name of George Raft, but Wilder said, and again, I'm quoting here, he recalls scraping the bottom of the barrel, as he put it, and going to George Raft to potentially play this part. And Raft was illiterate. So Wilder explained the entire plot to him, and about halfway through, and this is a fairly notorious story, Raft interrupts him, and he says, let's get to the lapel bit. Wilder says, what is the lapel bit? And Raft says, the lapel. Raft is getting annoyed. Like, how do you not know what I'm talking about? He goes, when the guy flashes his lapel, you see his badge, and he's a detective. And that scene wasn't in the movie. And that's when Wilder went, oh, you don't know what this is. You're not right for this at all. And I think it's great, though, that happened, because obviously that's how you get to Fred MacMurray. And Carrie, you brought up Edward G. Robinson.
Yeah.
Edward G. Robinson is somebody else whose inclusion in this movie, in the way he's included in this movie, is fascinating to me, because it was a change for him, because he'd been a big star since, I want to say, Little Caesar in
early
1930.
30s.
Absolutely.
In 1930, and this was a step down in a sense, because he was now not top billed, he was third lead.
But working with Billy Wilder is never a step down.
Yeah,
It's always
exactly.
a step in the right direction.
And he loved coming to work. I'm sure it didn't hurt that he was getting paid the same as the two top billed actors for fewer days of shooting. And he is just spectacular in this movie. And it's the relationship between Neff and Barton Keyes, the claims adjuster played by Edward G. Robinson, who knows something's not right. That if there is an emotional center to this movie, it is that relationship. A lot of people have gone so far as to say really the love story in this movie is between Neff and Keyes. And you get this absolutely wonderful, wonderful moment between the two of them at the end of the movie, where Neff has received his comeuppance and he dies in his friend's arms. They get this wonderful moment together where they, without literally saying, I love you too, they express such feeling for one another.
Well, there's a mutual respect as well.
Yes.
They're both like at fever pitch in terms of what they're both doing, even though being a claim rep or being an adjuster, as he supposedly is in the film, not really a very glamorous position. But clearly they're the best at it.
Yes. And there were, like I mentioned earlier, a number of changes that they had to make to the original screenplay to appease the Hayes office. Chief among them, in the original novella, the two main characters, Walter Neff and Phyllis Dietrichson, commit double suicide, effectively. That had to be changed. You couldn't end your movie that way. They would stipulate frequently that the heavy of the picture has to receive some type of comeuppance. So an ending was conceived, famously, where Walter Neff is apprehended and is sent to the gas chamber. And they shot this ending, but it has, in the years since, been lost. Now all that remains of it is, I believe I don't know if there's more than one. I know there's one still that you can find that is evidence that this sequence was in fact shot, but it was never included. And they realized the best ending to our picture is the one that we see now, is this ending where Neff dies in the doorway with his friend.
By the way, you kind of have spoiled this for people that have never seen it, just so people know.
I know spoilers for like an almost 100-year-old movie, but still.
What?
What?
It's not 100 years
100
old.
No,
years
it's not
old.
100 years old. It's 70,
In Lex terms,
80.
it's 100 years old.
What
but-
year are we in right now? This is 2015?
This is 2015.
Oh, that's like 70, give or take. Still, I'm rounding up. I'm rounding up to the centennial.
But one of the goals that we have, all of us,
Yes.
is for people to watch these movies.
Yes.
Clearly, so we don't want to destroy everything, obviously.
Sure. I will be so bold as to suggest you can reveal elements of the plot, but I don't think you can spoil this movie.
Not at all, because it's as good as films get. That's for sure.
Absolutely. It's also marked his first collaboration, Wilder, the director, with cinematographer John F. Seitz, and you see the iconic Venetian blind lighting, as they put it in this movie, where you use the Venetian blinds to create an effect, strips of light across actors' faces, which gives the impression, it's almost evocative of prison bars, showing the characters are trapped within their circumstance, which I find fascinating. He would work with Seitz again, most famously on Sunset Boulevard. When the movie was released, it was very well received. It received largely positive reviews from critics, even though some were made a bit uncomfortable by the content of the story. Alfred Hitchcock actually wrote to Wilder directly saying, "Since Double Indemnity, the two most important words in motion pictures are Billy and Wilder." So, as I mentioned before, I would venture to say that this really did mark Wilder's arrival.
Absolutely.
As it were. And of course, it is, Carrie, as you mentioned, maybe the quintessential film noir. If not the first, certainly the one that opened the floodgates. And it was after Double Indemnity and the success of that movie that we started to see many, many more pictures like it. The movie also, it is worth noting, earned 17 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actress, Best Screenplay, Best Cinematography. It, however, did not win any. But still.
Nominated for everything.
Nothing to sneeze at.
The thing about the Oscars is, we could do a whole episode on that too, but I feel kind of like time is the ultimate arbiter of excellence,
Absolutely.
not awards hype, which can be very, very fleeting.
Absolutely.
So we're still talking about that movie all these years later, and that says more than an
Almost
award
100
could.
years later, I hear.
I'm rounding up. So,
But a great film, nonetheless.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So he followed that up in 1945 with The Lost Weekend, which continued this trend of pushing boundaries creatively, because it was, if I'm not mistaken, the first Hollywood motion picture to really deal with the concept of alcoholism.
There have been others before, actually, but that one was a major one for sure.
Yeah, and it was difficult to play with those concepts under the production code, especially. And he worked with Ray Milland again, and this movie actually did win Ray Milland an Academy Award for Best Actor.
And Best Picture.
It did win Best Picture as well. And I also think it's interesting that it was released originally without a musical score, and audiences didn't respond to it incredibly well, and the movie was pulled, and they decided, we're going to add a score. And they brought in the composer Miklos Rosa, who would become a frequent collaborator of Wilder's, to write a score for it. And he it was one of the first movie scores to use the theremin pretty extensively, and that was apparently to create the pathos of alcoholism. But what I love about this score and about Lost Weekend in general, especially with the score that they went with, there's an almost science fiction quality to the music, if that makes sense. There's a lot of higher, these wailing sounds that I in my head I associate more with flying saucers and extraterrestrials.
At the time, you might not have. Though.
Oh yeah, but I love that about it, because it takes this very, very human problem of alcoholism and battling that particular demon and that particular disease, and it gives it, to me, a feeling of otherworldliness, this otherworldly, sinister problem that he's faced with, that he has to deal with, that he's not prepared to.
I do want to very, very briefly add, because the silent movie geek in me has to. There have actually been films since the very beginning of film that dealt with alcoholism. There were actually social issues silent movies, and of course in the sound era there was the early film called Merrily We Go to Hell, where Frederick March plays a spiraling out of control alcoholic. There was What Price Hollywood, the 30s version of A Star Is Born. So I mean, granted, Billy Wilder's again takes it to a different plane, but that issue had been dealt with numerous times and in many films throughout the years.
Sure. Okay. I'm still learning things. That's great. So that Lost Weekend was also a successful movie when it was re-released with the score attached to it, and it did. It won 4 Academy Awards, actually. Best Picture, Ray Milland won Best Actor, they won Best Screenplay, and he won Best Director. He followed that up with, in 1945, he directed a motion picture called Death Mills, which was a wartime American propaganda film, essentially. After that, made The Emperor Waltz in 1948, which starred Bing Crosby and Joan Fontaine. After that, 1948, Foreign Affair with Jean Arthur, Marlene Dietrich, and John Lund. And then we get to 1950. And in 1950, he releases a motion picture that I would say is just as enduring and influential as Double Indemnity and shares many stylistic traits in common, and that's Sunset Boulevard. So I wanted to let you guys jump in first before I start running my mouth about Sunset Boulevard, because there's so much that can be said about it.
Well, being a Billy Wilder fan, I truly think it's the most important film he's ever made. I think Sunset Boulevard is a film that basically transcends not just time, theme, and culture, but I feel as though most of the stuff that we come in contact with, and even you, as you've often spoken about David Lynch, Sunset Boulevard is a hugely influential film on Lynch in almost every way. He's gone on record as saying it's his favorite film, clearly pulling all kinds of things from that film, including characters and things like that. But getting back to Sunset Boulevard, a couple of quick notes. You had just mentioned the cinematographer that he was collaborating with. He wanted to originally begin the film, the screenplay that I guess had got approved and picked up. They actually shot, which opens, not to give anything away, because Carrie's right, we do want everybody to see these films, but the original version of Sunset Boulevard opens in a morgue with the corpses discussing matters, which leads to the story that is the narration that's going to basically later open the actual film. And they shot this and took it out to screen it in Thousand Oaks or Texas or wherever, and it got a lot of negative feedback because everybody just laughed. So they
laughed at the corpses talking.
They had no concept of what this movie was. So the corpses talking, which was all approved and shot and done, it was kind of like off track, especially after this success that he's had with the Oscars and everything. So they went back and redid it to the current opening, not to give anything away, but the opening of the film is one of the first films in, not necessarily maybe the silent films, but one of the first sound films that opens where the character is narrating, but he's already gone on, so to speak. And the opening shot that takes place in a swimming pool, just because you brought up the director of photography, they couldn't figure out a way to pull that off because they didn't have a tank. And they were experimenting with dummies and doing all kinds of things. So the way they figured it out is if you can get the water to be still, they used a mirror on the bottom of the pool to reflect as if somehow the camera was inverse, so to speak. But when you see the film, you'd never know in a million years. It looks as though they're shooting in the pool, so to speak.
Sure.
I brought this up because you were talking about how he pushes and breaks all these boundaries, which he clearly does. I just thought that everything he did in this film was beyond reproach. I couldn't see a false note. I think it's one of the best films I've ever seen. Somebody had gone on to say that he was somebody who believed that screenplay always came first, screenplay over the image. Never deviated from the script. The Olsen girl, I guess, the girl that plays the script girl.
Yes.
She's still alive, actually. I've seen her at Q&As.
She's a beautiful, beautiful woman to this day.
Nancy Olsen.
Nancy Olsen said that basically they didn't change a piece of the script, that he never deviated at all. It was all exactly as it was written because it was that good of a script. And you had brought up some things about your friend Louis B. Mayer, so to speak. Maybe you could share that story at the screening, because once the film was completed, it was clearly right on the bar, so to speak. But you were going to say about your friend Louis B. Mayer.
Yes, my close personal friend Louis B. Mayer. There was a train of thought, I suppose, held by certain individuals in the motion picture industry that Sunset Boulevard was, if not a scathing indictment of certain aspects of Hollywood, at the very least, Billy Wilder was biting the hand that fed, as it were. And following the screening, I believe, Byron, you mentioned that Louis B. Mayer in a fairly grand fashion, got up and walked out of the screening.
During the screening.
Yes.
Not even...
Didn't wait for it to end.
Getting the chance to see what happens.
Right.
It's already, like you said, such an indictment. So he storms out.
So he storms out, and he, in a fairly public way, lambasted Wilder. He saying things, the research I did, saying things like he's disgraced the industry that made and fed you. You should be tarred and feathered and run out of Hollywood.
Calls him a bastard.
Calls
Says,
him
bastard, how dare you.
Yes.
Which that is on record.
Yes.
I read a journalist quote that I thought was rather interesting. It happened last year when the Sony hack happened. And it said, Hollywood can bear many things. Transparency is not one of them.
Oh, absolutely.
And I thought, God, that totally applies to Sunset Boulevard, because that film is so honest about the way Hollywood really is. Everybody uses everybody else to get what they want, or at least to try. And you've got the lead character using Gloria Swanson to get, and she's using him, and that everybody's using everybody else. And it's so pitch black, but it's also so painfully accurate.
And
Yes.
some of the things behind the film, just like she said, are also pretty pitch black when they were trying to cast the film. Gloria Swanson was not the first choice.
Who was the first choice?
Mary Pickford.
Yes.
was one of the first choices, and basically she was in discussions with Billy Wilder. Excuse me, had the cough. They basically ran into a lot of problems because remember, Holly was very young at this time.
Yes.
She owned her own negatives, so if she was to do the film, which was going to be fine, she was going to own it, and they couldn't have that. So she kind of like took herself out of the game by being a entrepreneur, so to speak.
Well, the story I'd heard was that she wanted a lot more creative control.
Well, she wanted to change the dialogue.
And Wilder not going to concede.
Which makes sense. And this was a screenplay, another screenplay, if I'm not mistaken, he wrote with Brackett.
Correct. This is a Brackett, absolutely.
So eventually they did cast Gloria Swanson in this incredible role.
It was a suggestion by George Cukor.
Interesting.
They had gone to dinner, and he basically said, I'm having a problem. Clearly, he was running into all kinds of problems with Pickford, not just over the dialogue, the negative, and everything else. And he says, why don't you use Gloria Swanson? He said, I don't know if she would do it, because she had already had a failed career with someone who actually ends up in Sunset Boulevard, Eric von Stroheim, in the film Queen Kelly, which is actually in Sunset Boulevard. That's the film they're watching.
Yes.
Tons of art imitating life.
Which is great. But in the actual request for Swanson to be in the film, she somehow misunderstood at first, thinking it was going to be a secondary and supporting role.
Oh, sure.
As she was getting involved, and the more information was coming her way, she divorced her fifth husband, moved back to Hollywood, dedicated herself to the film, and she called it a return, not a comeback, which she uses that dialogue in the film.
Yeah.
To Joe by saying, oh, no, this is not a comeback, this is just a return, as if I've just been away for a little while.
By choice, of course.
And the Queen Kelly film, just because we were talking about the silent films as well, was financed by Joe Kennedy.
And it was an epic financial disaster, and the thing was shut down and never completed. So the footage that we see of Queen Kelly in Sunset Boulevard, as far as I know, is the first glimpse the public had of Queen Kelly.
At that time, because I have that film on DVD, the most complete version of it. It's a fantastic film.
So it's since become more accessible.
Oh, very, very much so. And the thing is, it's a great film. So all these stories that we hear, including the ones that Carrie probably is much more familiar with, of it failing and everything, when you see the film, which I have, it makes no sense because it's a great film.
Sure.
It's maybe more to do with timing, but Eric von Stroheim and her had a major falling out at that time of the film. Clearly, it's 1950. They're making this new film, and all is forgiven, so to speak.
And it's interesting because Eric von Stroheim was her director on that movie.
Correct.
And it's interesting that if they had this falling out over the lack of success of this particular film, it's interesting that when they return in Sunset Boulevard, Eric von Stroheim is cast in we'll say, a subservient position.
Well, Carrie said that life imitates art, I think, is what she said. And I think that one of the sad things, and she could probably go on a lot more than I could about this, the story of Eric von Stroheim and Gloria Swanson, I think, is so mixed up with what is said in Sunset Boulevard that most people think that he discovered her.
Sure.
Because in the course of the film, that's what he says, but these things get kind of mixed up, and no disrespect to fans of these older movies, a lot of people are not like Carrie or myself that want to go back, so they just kind of take the surface as it goes along. But in the end, I think that that kind of makes for better legacy, so to speak.
What is it when the
That's right.
legend becomes fact? Print the legend.
That's right.
I always want fact, though. I want to
know what the facts are. And one of the other facts is this film was not written for William Holden. It was written for Montgomery Clift.
Okay, I believe I read that.
And he was in
somewhere.
the process of agreeing to be in the lead, and he had gone to some type of getaway with one of his cronies.
Sure.
One of the agent's friends of somebody else that he knew, and he basically told him, "You don't want to do this film," and backed out at the last minute.
Do you know what the reasoning was for that?
At the time, I know it's hard to believe, and I'm sure Carrie will get a big kick out of this, but even in 1950, which clearly is the most conservative time, they were under the impression, because his star was on the rise, Montgomery Clift, that this was going to put him in a bad light. And at the time, I know it sounds ridiculous now because there's so many movies with all these different people that we've talked about, Gary Cooper and obviously William Holden, clearly Fred McMurray, all these different people. They really, truly thought this was going to hurt him, so he immediately backed out.
Because of the indictment of Hollywood type.
Well, plus his character's kind of
Content.
weak. He's a failed screenwriter.
He's a
He's deeply
gigolo.
in debt.
Having
He's a
sex
gigolo.
with this old lady.
Sure.
Yeah, not a sterling example of courageous heroism on film, right?
I suppose certainly not by the standards of the 1950s anyway.
Yeah.
I do think it's worth noting, and we've been talking a little bit about Gloria Swanson, the character that she plays, Norma Desmond, ostensibly the villain of the picture, but at the same time, this phenomenally tragic character. And it is interesting to me because she had been gone for a number of years. It was fascinating to me to watch her inhabit this role so completely, and like you say, a lot of art imitating life. But it really truly makes you feel for this ostensibly sinister, very off balance character. And I just think her performance is so striking, and it's so instantly iconic. And there are so many there are lines of dialogue that people have quoted over and over. And the people always slightly misquote it, but when you hear people say, "I'm ready for my close up, Mr. DeMille," it's from Sunset Boulevard.
Well, he had been her director when she was much younger, and he was a friend, he was a father figure, he was a mentor, and they were very close 30-something years prior. So that relationship is very similar to what you see in Sunset Boulevard.
And when they actually shot the film, the sequence that goes where he basically is shooting the film, he's shooting the actual film, Samson and Delilah.
On the Paramount lot.
So it's all real.
But here's the thing I'm
all
going to
real.
say about Gloria Swanson, though, is that all those photos you see in Norma Desmond's house, those are real-life photos of Gloria when she was young and when she was a huge star. But also, I think, where fact and fiction really blur, I think, is with Gloria, simply because she wasn't tragic as people assume. They kind of think she was Norma Desmond, and yeah, I mean, her career definitely petered out when sound came in. That is true, but
Many careers did.
Many
from that
careers
era.
did. So she certainly was not an exception, and she still was acting. I mean, she would still do films here and there. She actually helped several scientists and people escape from Europe during World War II. She sculpted, she had a clothing line later on. I mean, she was a very active woman. She wasn't sitting in some decaying mansion bemoaning her lost stardom. I mean, she wasn't really like that. And I think that's where people kind of get confused.
Sure. So I wanted to make one more note that I found interesting, and then we should move on. But we've been talking about on and off the award nominations that these motion pictures have accrued, and obviously Academy Award recognition is certainly not everything. I do think it's interesting. This movie, for my money, holds up just as well now as I think it played then. All four major acting categories this movie got a nomination for. Gloria Swanson was nominated, William Holden was nominated, Eric von Stroheim was nominated, and Nancy Olsen was also nominated. Of the various films that have attracted Academy Award nominations in all four categories, Sunset Boulevard, for whatever reason, is one of only three not to win in any of those categories. And I found it very fascinating that the other two are My Man Godfrey in 1936 and American Hustle in 2013.
What about Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Wouldn't that have gotten...
Did that get a nomination in all four categories?
I don't have my
someone on the
computer,
internet,
but,
please fact check this.
I think that got, if I'm not mistaken, at least four. But I think Liz actually did win for Virginia Woolf.
So then
actually.
that would, yeah. And there are other films, I'm sure, that have been nominated in all four categories, but at least one. And it's, again, it's astounding to me, and I would have to go and look up specifically who won what that year. But if you watch Sunset Boulevard, and you think to yourself, wait, by the judgment of the Academy, there were 4 other actors who did better than
Here's
everyone
what
in this
happened.
movie.
Betty Davis made her own return that year in All About Eve.
Sure.
So you've got another legendary star from decades earlier making a huge comeback with an A-list screenwriter, a brilliant film. And then I think maybe Gloria and Betty... Am I rambling on too much?
Oh God, no, not at all. I'm thinking that both those films are neck and neck that year. All About
Yeah.
Even Sunset Boulevard.
I think
You have to
Gloria-
kind of choose your film.
I think Gloria and Betty maybe split the vote because Judy Holliday won it for Born Yesterday, which
Which is a great performance.
you know.
Sure. So moving on, and we're going to jump ahead a little bit, and it's almost a shame, but it's in the interest of time, but we've got to jump over movies like 1951's Ace in the Hole, Stalag 17 in 1953, which was, I believe, the first prisoners of war film. And actually the release was held up a little bit because there was some question over whether or not people wanted to see a story about POWs.
Well, it's about the accuracy.
Sure.
And actually, one of the people that played the lead German in the film
Yes.
was somebody from Germany who basically had ties to Nazis. I don't want to open a can of worms, but that's a bigger topic, obviously. I'm agreeing with you 100%. It's certainly not something where they had a few bumps, a lot of bumps.
Sure, a lot, but it's because of the success of Stalag 17 that we have movies that came after, like for Great Escape is the first example that popped
Which is
into my head.
fantastic.
Amazing movie. Sabrina, 1954, with William Holden, Humphrey Bogart, and Audrey Hepburn. There's some notorious stories about clashes between Bogart and Wilder on the set of that movie.
Can't imagine.
Oh, really? Go figure. We talked about both 1955's The 7-Year Itch and 1957's, no, it's not 1957, 1959's Some Like It Hot on our Monroe episode, part 2 of our Monroe episode. We talked a little bit about Some Like It Hot's notoriously troubled production. And actually, apparently...
But clearly an important film.
And
Yeah.
absolutely, and if I'm not mistaken, was released by United Artists without a production code seal of approval.
Which is one of the things we were talking about earlier when we were talking about the Haze. We had actually talked about in one of our earlier episodes, the Howard Hawks episode, Scarface as well, released without. So even though we're talking about how much of an influence that has,
Yes.
if you have the money or you have the right, the wherewithal, so to speak, you're going to be able to find a way around it, even though clearly it was an impending doom, so to speak, because that's the message to the people. This is okay. This is safe entertainment.
Sure.
Scarface clearly not.
No. But we wanted to jump ahead because, Carrie, you wanted to talk about 1960s The Apartment.
Oh my gosh. Well, you know how much I advocate the big screen, and I kind of hate watching stuff on my TV at home because it's like the size of that or something.
Sure.
Anyway, I got to see The Apartment on a giant screen at the Chinese Theater with Shirley MacLaine present for Q&A at the TCM Film Festival last year. Honestly, that'll always be one of the great movie highlights of my whole movie nerd life because it doesn't get better than that. It just doesn't. My God, it was so great. Yeah, in The Apartment, Jack Lemmon plays an office worker in a New York firm, and he's trying to climb the corporate ladder, and in the effort to do that, he is letting numerous executives use his apartment for secret trysts. But, of course, romantic complications ensue. And Shirley MacLaine stars with him in this film. One thing I love so much about this movie is how deeply invested you become in the characters. I think one thing that not all, but a lot of films kind of lack today is characters that you really care about.
Sure.
I can tell you how many more modern movies I see where I don't feel any care or investment in what happens to these characters. But in The Apartment, you absolutely feel that. You just feel so emotionally connected to them and really devastated when, things happen to them. And the dialogue is so brilliant. The relationships between the characters are so delicately and skillfully built out. And it's just, to me, one of Wilder's, among many, many great triumphs. Truly.
Absolutely. And it's also of note that it's his first, if I'm remembering correctly, is this not his first collaboration with Jack Lemmon?
I think they did Irma La Dolce after this.
Yes, Irma La Dolce was, that was 63.
Think so. I can't remember off the top of my head, but
No, actually, I'm sorry. They did Something Like It Hot together, but this...
Something Like It Hot. Yeah, well,
of
Something Like It
course.
Hot. Yeah, of course.
Are you sitting here?
I'm sorry?
I'm just teasing. It's like, yeah, of course. That's the one that was their first
I
relationship.
was like, what? Wait, yeah.
I hate to say first anything, because anytime the word first comes out of my mouth,
But Something Like It
somebody
Hot's the
somewhere,
first.
and even sometimes me, will
Something
prove
Like
me
It
wrong.
Hot's the first.
Yeah.
So-
Something Like It, but they would collaborate numerous times
Yeah, numerous
going forward.
times. Yeah, absolutely.
And also, The Apartment reteamed Wilder and Fred McMurray, who once again played a character certainly not as dark as his character in Double Indemnity,
but still very dark.
But still very dark. Still a big departure from the nice guy roles that Fred McMurray was
No, My
known
Three
for.
Sons, I guess, in this. That's what you're saying.
No, My Three Sons. No.
Not at all.
Chip and Ernie Douglas?
Not at all. I was going to ask you, Carrie, when you did your research, did you uncover the company that the apartment was based on, like where that idea had kind of come from? I know it's a great script.
I'm sorry.
The script's very sharp.
I didn't have a chance to...
So I just figured because you didn't really know too much about the background on the...
I didn't. This is the most recent of all of Wilder's movies that I've watched, so that's kind of why I felt like talking about it, because it's just in my head. I didn't really... I'm sorry. Shame on me. I did not read the backstory on this movie, but I just love it, though. I just love it. So that's why I went to talk about it.
It's a good one. I know just for a fact, because of the relationship I had with a company I worked for many years ago, the actual company that was used as the blueprint for this was actually State Farm Insurance.
Interesting.
And it seems kind of hard to imagine, because in the film it's not an insurance company from what I recall, but they kind of displace everything. Clearly the keys are such a big part of the movie and these revolving characters. And then when I heard this the first time, I didn't even give it justice, because I think, well, that's impossible. Because I worked for State Farm Insurance. So clearly there was nothing like that going on when I was there. What are they talking about?
That you knew of.
But the idea came from something else. I actually think the topic of what was happening came from their home office in Illinois. Clearly they just relocated it to New York or whatever. I truly think The Apartment, much like Sunset Boulevard, is one of his better films.
Yes.
Just fantastic. Not that I care for it more so. I just think it's a fantastic film.
Yeah, I tend to find myself drawn more towards... I mean, all of his movies are big character-driven movies, and you get these, even in big, sprawling stories, you get, I would say, fairly intimate portraits of the people playing parts in these stories. But I love when he makes a movie like The Apartment, because it's all very, very contained. And it is literally, the characters in the movie are the movie. Jack Lemmon, Shirley MacLaine, Fred McMurray, they are the movie, and you feel like you get to know them so well in a way that I think even other movies of the era, other movies of any era really, you don't always see.
Well, like Carrie said, though, you have to invest in the character, and I'm totally invested in that film and those characters, even the bad guys. And clearly, like she said, the stuff that we're seeing today, I can be as happy as I want when I go see a movie, but if I can't connect, I mean, what's the point, really?
Yeah, and it's like, I know I'm a pretty emotional person, but sometimes in older movie, I find myself like crying or getting so emotional when something bad happens or whatever. I don't get that nearly as much in modern day film. I just feel like a lot of character development is really lost. Not overall, but to a large degree in movies made today. It's totally different.
It has to do with those kids. They're all so young, they don't have any patience.
Those silly
We can't have
kids.
any backstory. We've got to move to the next shot.
Silly
We
kids
gotta go.
Our silly little attention spans.
Now, I count you as one of those people. Just because you have an open mind.
I will
come on.
take full responsibility for the death of cinema, ladies and gentlemen. It was
Today.
entirely my fault.
This Thanksgiving, that's it.
Yeah, it was me. So I do want to cover some of the other movies that Billy Wilder made, and he had still a fairly prolific career after The Apartment.
Even his last film, which was a box office hit.
So yeah, and the last movie he made was Buddy Buddy, and he's gone on record as saying he wasn't tremendously happy with the way it turned out, which is a shame. But before that, he did, you mentioned Irma la Douce, he did that in 1963, 1964, the endearingly titled Kiss Me Stupid. 1966, The Fortune Cookie, which I think is worth noting because it was the first teaming of Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau, who would go on to do, I believe, 10 films together over the remainder of their careers. So that's not nothing. Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, Avanti, The Front Page in 74 with Wilder and Matthau, which was an adaptation of...
Which was at least the 8th version of that story.
Yes.
Even though it was great. Wilder's great.
And it was based on the play of the same name that Howard Hawks used as the basis for His Girl Friday. He just gender swapped the Hildy character. And then...
Gender swapped.
Gender swapped. Yeah, gender swap.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, that's a term. In 1978, Fedora, that he reteamed with William Holden for, and then 1981's Buddy Buddy, which was also Lemmon and Matthau, which, as I mentioned, he was not the most fond of. It didn't necessarily turn out the way he had hoped for one reason or another.
Well, I think Hollywood was changing. I think that had a bigger part to it than necessarily the actual film.
Sure.
Because I think the film holds up like some of his other films but context and time is everything.
When he had talked a little bit after 1981, after that movie, about how he did feel a little bit like his age was keeping him from getting certain jobs or being able to get certain movies made. And whether or not that was true, and I certainly do believe there was more than an element of truth to it, because Hollywood can be a little unforgiving as far as people's ages are concerned and what jobs they will or will not get based on their age. He would continue to collaborate with IAL Diamond a number of times, and he had been working with Diamond most of his the last chunk of his filmography are collaborations with Diamond, and they would continue to collaborate together till Diamond died, I believe, in '88. But none of their work ever made it to the screen. And while he was attempting to get certain motion pictures together to try and get them off the ground, to try and get them made, he also became very involved in the art world. He famously put together this really impressive collection of artistic works, and it inspired him to create his own, and they would be showcased at various galleries around Los Angeles. Eventually, and when I say eventually, I mean he had a good long run. He was alive until 2002.
Yeah, he lived to be 95.
Which is incredible. Like, that's an incredible run. He outlasted almost all of his collaborators, and he died in 2002 of pneumonia after battling different complications, including cancer. He's buried right next to Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau, or not, if not right next to, certainly nearby. Marilyn Monroe is in the same cemetery. Her crypt is located in the same cemetery.
His grave says, "I was a writer, but then nobody's perfect."
And I love that apparently the French newspaper Le Monde, the day after he died, their headline said, "Billy Wilder dies, nobody's perfect," which I think is tremendous. So we do have to start wrapping up, but before we go, any thoughts on the legacy of Billy Wilder, on what he means to you, on what you think he means to movies, any wrap-up umbrella sentiments that you would like to share?
A few years back, there was a book written by Tony Curtis and the great historian Mark Vieira. It was about the making of Some Like It Hot. And I actually got hired to be a research assistant on that book, which meant I had to spend some days at the Academy Library basically reading through telegrams, letters, and memos between Billy Wilder and Arthur Miller. And so to get paid to sit at a desk and transcribe those memos for several days,
sure,
best job in the world you can imagine. And this is obviously private correspondence, not meant for anybody other than the recipient. He was so funny.
Yeah.
And this is just a private, business correspondence, but reading it's kind of this little intimate window into someone's mind when you read things they wrote to somebody else personally. And I just sat there thinking, my goodness, what a brilliant mind that we got to have for a while in Hollywood, and what incredible legacy he left for us. I mean, he was so smart and so gifted, and wow, it made me miss him, even though I never got a chance to meet him, if that makes any sense.
It does. Absolutely. Byron, anything?
I could speak a little bit about the book that he did with Cameron Crowe, who's clearly a contemporary.
Oh, no.
That he basically did a series of interviews with him in his biography. It's kind of like a ghost-written book. I would not say, as Carrie was talking about the one that she did the research on, I would not say it's one of his better biographies, but it's much like she was saying, very accessible, because it's almost like a series of conversations, so to speak. But in the end, instead of saying anything about what was written about him, I have to kind of paraphrase Carrie. See the films.
Absolutely.
There is not, out of everything you've named today, there is not a bad one in the bunch.
Nope.
It's great work. Everything it's just like Hawks. There's no false notes.
It is astounding when you look at Billy Wilder's filmography and you look at the list of titles, because every one of them holds up so incredibly well. And then to also conceptualize that they all came from the same guy.
Color, black and white, widescreen, not. He does everything.
It is staggering. So I would agree 100%. Check out as many of Wilder's movies as you can. All of them. Dude, you're not wasting your time. Your time will be well invested.
And if there's any way, I say this probably every show, but that's all right. Any way you can see these on the big screen, please do it. A few years ago, I've seen Sunset Boulevard a million times. I got a chance to see it in the 104-year-old Palace Theater in downtown LA. That kind of rocked my world. I gotta say, it was absolutely incredible. So big screen actually is always best, especially for someone like Wilder.
Absolutely. Guys, check out the films of Billy Wilder. We're all really big fans. I can't imagine you won't be once you watch these movies.
Next week?
next week, do you want to tease what we're doing next week?
William Castle.
Yeah, we're doing William Castle.
All right.
We are going to talk about William Castle next week, but that is going to do it for us this week on Historic Hollywood. I am Lex Michael. I'm all over the internet. My handle everywhere is @TheLexMichael.
Byron Thompson.
Carrie Bible, cemeterytour.com.
All right, and that's going to do it for us. Join us next week for our conversation on William Castle. We look forward to it. We will see you then. Thank you for watching.
Thanks.
From producers Maria Menounos, Kevin Undergaro, Phil Svitek, and the entire Popcorn Talk Network, we would like to thank you for tuning in. For questions or comments, be sure to visit popcorntalk.com. I'm Sir Richard Wentworth, and this has been a presentation of the Popcorn Talk Network.
The views expressed herein are those of the hosts only and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Popcorn Talk Network or its owners or principals.